Welcome back, everyone, to this very interesting panel discussion on global social PR media disasters, lessons from United Airlines and Pepsi, among others. Anyone from United Airlines or Pepsi in the audience? No? Great. So this session will be moderated by Lars Ferdich from Precious Communications. He has over 15 years' experience in managing and defending brand reputation, both in-house and on agency side. He started Precious Communications in 2012 out of Singapore, and in just 5 years, the firm has grown the business into a 30-strong team. He has previously worked with brands such as Coca-Cola, DHL, Heineken, Huawei, Jabra, Porsche, P&G. There's a lot of brands here. It's a very enviable list, Lars. And he has a Masters of Economics degree from the University of Hanover in Germany. Please welcome Lars, and I'll let him introduce the panel.
Yeah, it's on. Okay, fantastic, much better. So thanks for choosing us over early lunch. We have an exciting panel, so many disasters out there. I always say it's exciting to talk about crisis when they're over, when it's over, right? So I'll let the panel introduce themselves first. We have great panelists here with tons of experience from real 360 experience. That's what Umbrella 360 is about. So I would kindly ask for Karen to start introducing herself briefly with her current role and experience and excitement about crisis and disasters. Karen.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Karen Yu. I head the brand and communications team at MediaCorp. We have over 50 products, and we serve virtually everyone in Singapore, providing content and reaching 97% of people in Singapore every week. So we're a company that's pretty much out there, and we have our share of crisis from time to time.
Hi everyone, I'm Lena. I'm an account director at Meets and Communications. So over the past decade of my life, I've been privileged, perhaps not so privileged, to work on quite a few crises. I would say the most notable one would be for an Australian mining firm looking to set up shop in a small fishing village in Malaysia, and with that, we had to go against local politicians who used that as really a bandwagon for them to champion against the client of mine. But it was an interesting time, and glad that we survived.
Hello, everybody. My name's Stephen. I head up DigiMind for APAC. We're a social listening platform, so we help a lot of brands on different marketing activities, but of course, crisis is one of those. Probably the biggest crisis that I've worked on so far was the MH370 crisis when the plane disappeared. It was, first of all, a big crisis because of the situation, but also because we'd only been in Singapore about 3 or 4 months, and we got tasked with going on Channel News Asia and talking about it live on TV. So a personal crisis, trying to make sure that you manage that situation in the right way, because of the nature of it was quite difficult, and yeah, one that was quite challenging.
Hi, my name is Suchi. I started Q Communications in 2014. I don't have hands-on real experience with crisis, but I'm always looking out at how to mitigate the risk for my clients in the financial sector.
Hi, my name is Claire, and I'm a regional director at Ogilvy. So my mic just went on. So with my role, I'm half on PR and half on social. So we've seen a lot of Venn diagrams in the past 2 days in every single presentation. So if you look at the social PR Venn diagram, crisis is right at the middle. And we deal with it day in, day out. I guess the most recent one I have, not the biggest, would be SMRT's pipes that broke. Topical, right? Yeah.
Good, thank you very much. So let's directly dive into it. The panel is presented as starting with United Airlines and Pepsi. Let's start with a more obvious one. United Airlines was in the headlines for the wrong reasons, most likely. Obviously, they had a passenger removed from a plane earlier this year by force. He was bleeding, was pulled off the aircraft, and I think that was step one. And then the CEO came out and said, "My staff just followed procedure." it's easy to point fingers and says, you know, they did it all wrong. So instead of saying, you know, bashing what went wrong, from a communications perspective, very quick one, what do you think they should have done differently after the situation appeared? I know it's obvious, best thing is that didn't happen in the first place, but after the video came out with somebody seemed to have been beaten up and pulled off the plane, what should have been the best or first move for an airline if you would have been in their shoes? Maybe Karen, you want to start?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing that United should have acknowledged was that they had violated the human rights of this passenger, and that it was a very core violation of their mission, right, to serve their customers and treat them humanely when they're on the plane. So because it was a core violation, they really had to apologize unequivocally and with complete remorse immediately, but they failed to do so. And like you say, there was serious injury, and their inability to apologize properly was really a serious insult to that serious injury.
So maybe Claire, on the other side, from a brand perspective, if you would be in charge working with an airline and that happens, what would be your first advice beyond you have to apologize to the brand? What would be other kind of must-do steps?
Yeah, so we have a lot of brands who do apologize, but they're what we call empty apologies, right? They're like, we're sorry this happened, and then it ends there. So we always try to push for emotional and visual content. So, you know, United has been discussed by all of my clients, all of them freaked out. Something I always ask is, even here, a show of hands, how many of you have seen the man being dragged out in your news feeds, in your social media? So that's pretty much everyone. So, and the next question is, how many of you have seen the response from United CEO in your news feeds? So that cut it by half, right? And usually you see it like 4 to 5 times in the news feed, but the apology doesn't really show up because it's not visual or emotional. I actually had to look for it. I'm like, did they say anything? What did they? Oh yeah, there's like one sentence. So I would always push for emotional and visual content, like what Tony Fernandez did for AirAsia. That was very powerful. Yeah.
Then they went, United went through a little bit of, so first he said, we followed procedure. Then he tried to come back from that. Talking about we have to do an apology, we should connect emotionally. Maybe Chuchi, what would you advise a client or a brand or in a situation? How do you get it right? Everybody's under pressure. Everybody's saying you have to do something. How do you keep that calm voice in your head and say, okay, that's step 1, that's step 2. How do we get it right?
Yeah, it's a complex and difficult question for a lot of clients. I think in any situation, especially for crisis, the first thing you want to do is stay calm, listen to your inner voice, and also act fast, because social media can go viral. Everyone is a newsbreaker as well as a newsmaker. For instance, I think if we just localize the context, a couple months ago, people in Singapore will know what happened to our Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong and the sibling rivalry about Oxley Road. At a time when that news broke, it was on Facebook. It was a different time zone from where our Prime Minister was. But I think he reacted really well. He went up to a video and recorded something which was unscripted. It felt like unscripted. It felt very authentic. So I think getting that message out, you know, with your wits and with the right PR people surrounding your brand and yourself, you could actually get that disaster rectified in a very quick manner. Yeah.
So we talked about social media, and more, this screen is the window to the world. If it doesn't happen, if it's not on the screen, it doesn't happen, but if it happens, that's where we see it first, right? So, Stephen, from your perspective, what are some of the mechanics to be really ahead of the curve, or really know when does the temperature change, when does the tide change, that I really can jump in? And then from a social media perspective, how can we get into that scenario where time matters, but we don't want to rush it, so it's like that conflict of fast but right?
Yeah, totally. And I don't think it is necessarily about reacting with a super fast pace. It's about giving yourself time, understanding the situation, and really thinking about the way that you should respond. And using data really is the first point of contact that you should be looking at, in my opinion. understanding the sentiment, the things that people are saying about the brand, how serious is the crisis. In United Airlines' case, I mean, when people are talking about boycotting the brand, I think that was one of the key hashtags was boycott United. I mean, that's going to directly impact sales for the business. And I think as soon as crisis starts to impact the sales of the business, then you're reaching a situation where it's a proper crisis. So at that point, you need to see what the reach is of the data. Is this something that's being spoken about just in America? Or in this case, it was being spoken about on Weibo, I think, in China. So it was reaching right across the globe. And if they'd been looking at that data, I think they probably would have responded in a slightly different way, rather than just saying, yeah, we were following protocol, because clearly the sentiment right across the globe was negative, and everybody could see what was happening right across the globe. It wasn't something that just happened in the US.
So having those listening tools is part of a preparedness strategy. Being prepared is everything, but my experience shows me a little bit like being prepared and getting a crisis preparedness is a little bit like buying insurance. A lot of times you want to buy it after you broke your leg, a little bit late for that. So Lena, from your experience, how do we really work in-house or with brands to get preparedness right?
For sure. I think building social currency is very important even before an issue or before a crisis strikes. So that really means, having the commitment to go into the communities you're in, go speak to and engage with the consumers that your brand is targeted towards, and building that brand love is really important, because once they do have that great trust and that open dialogue, that open conversation, they feel like your brand and perhaps even the leader right on top is able to is listening and understands the needs. So when a crisis does hit, there are instances in the case where you have your third-party advocates and folks there who are more credible who will step in and say, okay, hang on, we understand this issue is out there, but let's listen to what the brand has to say, and then we can obviously react post-crisis as well.
Building that social currency, and one example maybe is also it's very easy to talk about brands that are in the customer's face, right? But I remember the biggest container shipping line in the world, Maersk Shipping from Denmark. They started a social media strategy like 8 years ago, going on Facebook, showing their ships around the world, the Emma Maersk, just to build that social currency and social karma. And the clear strategy was we want to connect with people, so when something gets wrong, not if, at least we have some credibility and we are on the right channels, and we need to build communication channels, right? For MediaCorp, it's a little bit different, Karen. You don't need to build communication channels, you own them. But how do you deal with a situation where you have just too many faces of a brand? Because yes, you have MediaCorp, the entity, but it's what we know is all your talents on TV, off TV, on screen. How do you make sure that you all sing the same tune? In United was all the CEO who got it all right or all wrong. How do you make that singing in the same tune happen for an organization like yours, where you have so many faces of a brand?
Well, we don't want them to all sing the same tune about everything, but there are a number of principles that we abide by, and that's why we have our core values: respect, trust, and drive. Almost forgot the drive. And these are really important because they provide, in a sense, a moral compass, right, for dealing with all our relationships. And we do have a great number of stakeholders. You're right, we've got a great number of faces. We also have a great number of stakeholders. We have our audience primarily. Like I said, we serve everyone in Singapore, and we touch them in different ways across our multiple platforms. So issues do come up from time to time. We don't expect everybody to refer back to corporate communications, right? People are empowered because they have a responsibility, they have a role, they have an understanding of what we stand for fundamentally, what's important to us, and they should be able to communicate and, I would say, apologize if wrongdoing has happened, right, within their capacity.
So maybe can you share a situation where it was really, where you worked on a concrete apology, right? Everybody knows we have to apologize, we have to be sincere, but getting it right is harder than you think. Maybe you can share an example.
Sure. I look back at a crisis that happened in a previous company a few years ago. We drove an ad campaign that promoted our assertion that we were an honest company. And to do that, we tried to juxtapose ourselves against other professions that might have a reputation for being less than honest at times. So we're talking about used car dealers and contractors in the construction space. And we depicted salespeople and, in those situations where they were being blatantly dishonest. And of course, we were called out by one of these associations, which happened to have about 30,000 members. And we were asked, aren't you the pot calling the kettle black? And what gives you the right to say that you're more honest than other people, or to actually deride our profession? So we had good intentions, we did. And in fact, we had green-lighted this all the way from the creative agency to the media agency, the production team, on the client side, the brand team, and even senior leaders. But I think what we failed to recognize was that we should have had the green light from uninvolved parties as well, so that we get a totally objective view to how the creative concept might be perceived. So like I say, we had the best intentions, and truly it was an honest company. It was a very good creative agency as well, with a very, very good idea. But I guess the execution just, the point of failure was not in consulting a broader audience. So back to your question about the apology, we actually had to do it twice. The first one, which was done kind of in the middle of the night and in a rush, and to Stephen's point, you don't always have to, try to get ahead so quickly, it came across as a bit of a half apology. And we didn't have to retract it, but we had to build on it. So the apology, which we worked with the creative agency in the afternoon and put out the same day, was unequivocal, and it was absolute, and it was accepted. Having said that, there was an opportunity lost, right? Because we had spent months on the campaign, and we had to pull it within days. So even if a crisis doesn't have a very long-term impact on your stock price or your business or brand sentiment, I think that we need to consider the opportunity lost as well.
Talking about an opportunity lost of a campaign that was pulled, obviously Pepsi comes to mind. They had a campaign out that wanted to show social inclusion of Generation Y, Z, with a very popular face out of the US leading it and bringing everybody together, having a good time, and a Pepsi, and that backfired, and they had to pull it out. Mrs. Generation Y, what do you think? Juchi, that's how you branded yourself. So yeah. What do you think went wrong? Where did they get wrong? Didn't they ask the right stakeholders in the beginning, or was it wanted that they wanted to have a discussion? Because I remember Benetton in the past was bold, and they wanted to have a critical discussion. I think Cathay and Freedom to Laugh earlier this year in Singapore, they wanted to have that discussion. Yeah. Do you think it was wanted to get into the critical discussion? And how could they have avoided the outreach and the backlash that actually happened?
I mean, these days, all of us are getting more and more discerning as consumers. So when we see something like Pepsi having a feel-good music video with Kendall Jenner there, and like all these human rights and all these feel-good kind of things coming together, it's a bit too good to be true. It's pretty staged. I think if you're discerning, you know what is real versus fake. You'd be like, yeah, this and Pepsi sells, no way, man. We all know that Pepsi has a lot of sugar, it's bad for your health. It's not going to unite the world together with just one can of Pepsi. So I think in many ways, again, with marketing, with crisis, with social media, it's always good to listen to what the public wants. I think yesterday throughout the conference, we've listened to a lot of good speakers saying that we should tap more into data with Google, Facebook, and all that. It really helps you segment the market a bit better. So I think just taking a bit more time and effort to analyze the data of how people feedback with social media, it really helps to direct the messaging a bit clearer out there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Claire, you're working with some of the biggest brands on the planet. 2 questions. At which stage do you do kind of that sanity check and make sure, like, it sounds like a good idea, it looks like a good idea, but we don't want to have another Pepsi or a Dove example where if you just look from a different perspective, it actually gets so wrong.
Yeah, it's a bit crazy how these even left the boardroom because some of our really good, safe ideas don't even make it out the door. But what we usually do for brands is we always have the torture test checklist. So for example, let's take Pepsi, right? Every campaign that goes out from the beginning to end, we do the research, we look at the audience groups. But before we launch, we'll publicize the company, but also look at the stakeholders involved. And we have a comprehensive list of stakeholders that every brand will interact with, from the families of the employees, retired employees, current employees, all the environmental groups, their primary and secondary audiences, people who, government, politicians, influencers, online and offline media. So it's a list of about 25 stakeholders. And then the next column would be, will they be affected by the ad, yes or no? And then the next column is, how will they be affected? So if you look at Pepsi, you look at, obviously it's a campaign about racial harmony. So you look at people who are activists. And then you see, will they be affected? That's a clear yes. How will they be affected? Because you're undermining their cause. So that's something we will actually go to the groups and test. So we'll show them the ads. So it's almost like a focus group discussion that tells us and echoes back to us the initial sentiment, like a soft launch.
But in this day and age of 24/7 on, we have to be fast, we have to direct fast. Do we still have the luxury of time to, do all those checklists that take 5 months from the ideation to get it out on different screens?
No, that's actually a really good question. So I work with a lot of government accounts. And before we even jump on, because they always say, hey, we want something innovative and amazing and progressive, but it has to be ABC. So what we did was we actually got all their buts. And some of them are 4 pages long, Times New Roman 10. No, like racial harmony, multiple races, no politically incorrect terms, no this and that. I work with Coke, and we have a list of that for each region. So Coke, for example, you can't have, there's a gender balance. For certain markets, you can't have pork along with the food. So it's really good for every brand to think about it in this sense and do the list before it happens. So it's a lot easier, right? You don't waste all this money. So you have, okay, nope, it doesn't meet every criteria. Let's redo this bit. Yeah.
Let's jump to another crisis. The Dove campaign recently got a lot of flack. They had basically, the campaign was about that their product was good for women of any kind of skin tone and type. Skin tone, type, dry, and whatever. And they had women morphing from one to the other. So it was Hispanic, there was black, there was Asian, there was white, and it was actually a whole scene. However, somebody picked out that one scene where a black woman turned into a white woman. It was, so it's the typical superiority of the white race. If you look at the whole spot, it was actually really, you couldn't, if you use that, you can never win. If you put the white woman first, it's always the white woman first. If you put it last, it's always the last. It was actually a morphing out of 3 or 5 different races, taking out of context. How do you deal with these crises that are coming out of context parts, right? So many times you have politicians now that are quoted out of context. I want to be the next prime minister. We had that last week in Singapore of one of the ministers taking out of context. Reuters actually had to change the story. How do you deal with these crises that are coming out of context? And Dove was one of those out of context crises. Maybe, Lena, you can share. How do you deal with that situation where you are right, they are wrong, but that's not the way we should deal with a crisis, right?
No, for sure. I think the main thing for any brand to do is to acknowledge the dissent, right? It's always coming from a place where, unfortunately, because of social platforms, anyone can jump on the bandwagon and pick out just a few of your key messages and completely misconstrue the initial message, which would come from a good place. And it's surprising that this happened to Dove as well, because Dove, as we all know, they're always about, diversification and inclusivity. So this was a situation where I think brands like Dove could certainly jump in and start by acknowledging this, and at the same time, having that open dialogue to try and see, try and explain basically themselves of where the campaign was initially coming from, because the campaign idea came from a good place, right? So it's about getting that point of view across as well.
Stephen, crisis normally happens at a moment when we least expect it, that, Sunday morning, 2:35 kind of moment. Tools and social media are always on, it's around the clock, it's around the world. How can we deal with that always on situation, reality, when most of our working hours should be during daytime and not on weekends?
I mean, that's just a consequence of social media today, right? I mean, it is always on, and I think for brands, the most important thing is to realize that it's not just on your own channels. It can happen absolutely anywhere on the web. Out there in earned media, and it's super important to make sure that you're covering absolutely every base. When you talk about content, and again, I think it's a consequence of social media in the fact that we'll probably see more and more crisis or issues happening around content, because brands have to create more and more content every day now. And that's, by the very nature of that, like you just said, how do you go through all of those different checkpoints? You can't possibly do it with the rate of content that has to be created. So there will always be things that are missed or misviewed by somebody. And it's very difficult for brands, I think, to
you
manage that.
mentioned in the lead up to the panel that you used the term, and I love that, at the speed of shame is as fast as the speed of the internet. So is the social media sphere unfair by default, and how do we prepare for that, if that would be the case?
Just trying to get alerted to things as soon as they're happening. Monitoring every part of your organization, monitoring your key executives, if anything happens around them, monitoring products, getting different product managers or brand managers involved so that they know what's happening around their products, looking at competitors as well, and even partners. We worked on a project with Intel and Lenovo, and it was the Superfish issue that happened. And Intel wanted to see, it was, I can't remember exactly what Superfish was, but basically Intel wanted to see how this particular issue was going to impact them as a brand, because they were putting their processors into the laptops that Lenovo were producing. As it turned out, there was no correlation between that particular example, but they had to be aware of even things that their partners and customers are doing as well. So I think being fully aware of everything that's happening in your environment, and just with the tools today, not just DigiMind, setting up alerts, understanding the negative things that can happen is super important.
It's easy, and we touched on that briefly before, to be prepared is everything. But I just remember, not sure everybody in the audience remembers, there was Domino's Pizza had a massive crisis about 8-9 years ago. It was the first kind of YouTube crisis where 2 employees in the middle of nowhere in the US played with food items, put them in their nose, their pants, put it on a sandwich. It was never actually clear if those sandwiches were sent out or not, but it became an internet sensation and resulted with the president of Domino's USA going on a YouTube clip and expressing his concern and how sincere he was that. And I remember that script because it was a mix of him really being outraged and emotional and passionate. And then there were 2 paragraphs of corporate communication speak. in between, so the language didn't match. What was great, because one of the first CEOs who went on YouTube in that half-casual style, and it hasn't been done before, so he got a lot of respect for trying, though he got a lot of things wrong. He didn't wear a suit, he wore a Domino's shirt, he was in a pizza outlet, so a lot of things, right? That's 8 years ago. 8 years down the road, are your or your client CEOs prepared to go on YouTube within half an hour if something happens on Sunday night? We can't say, oh, we didn't know that would happen, right? So would your team be prepared to go on camera by default, but would your CEO be ready to do a half-casual, non-scripted apology talk?
I think so. It depends on the extent to which the violation or the mistake is caused to the business. If it's caused to the business and it's very severe, then absolutely the guy on top has to take charge and own the story. And what I like about the Domino story is that there is actually some merit to coming across unprepared, but just putting yourself out there, because speed signals sincerity, right? You're not completely prepped, but you do have something to say, and probably what you have to say has to do with an apology, right? Or at least like an acknowledgement of having failed your customer. And I think that's very important.
I mean, yeah, crisis management, crisis communications 101 within a certain early time frame. All you have to do is acknowledge. We acknowledge that this happened. We let you in on more information as we have. We're working on it. If you don't do that, people know that you're not in control, and the vacuum builds that's filled with social media, speed of shame, and other things, right? Lena, quickly to wrap this up, what do you think should Dove have done? Pull it or don't pull it? If you would have been in charge, would you have pulled the ad campaign? Or you would have said, no, we sit it out, we stand by it, and the discussion is good?
That's a hard question, Lars, but I believe that because, there is so much negativity involved around the ad, I would sincerely pull it, and also at the same time, acknowledge the sentiments that the consumers have shared, from the ground up. I mean, these are Dove customers, potential Dove customers as well, and it's important to hear what they're saying, and if they disagree with the ad, even though it was misconstrued and it's a completely different perception, I believe that we should pull in and respect the views and what folks are saying as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's open the floor to some questions that you might have. Otherwise, I have 200 more. The gentleman here in the middle table, we'll start with him, and then we'll move over, I think, to the table over there.
Thank you.
If you could start with your name and organization.
Sure. Hello. There we go. Hi. Glenn from Van Media Group here in Singapore. My question is for Stephen. Stephen, the MH tragedy was notable because of just how badly the Malaysian government handled it. In terms of, in the first 24 or 48 hours, there were like, I think, as I recall, maybe 3 or 4 different ministries being the official spokes.
Sorry, which one was that for, sorry?
There were 3 or 4 different ministries who were acting as the official spokesmen.
For which crisis, sorry?
For Malaysian Airlines.
Oh, sorry.
Malaysian Airlines, MH, yeah. So it was notable because there were so many different voices coming out and being the voice, and they weren't saying the same thing, which, of course, in a crisis we know is not what you want. So from your perspective, was that hard from the social listening element to try to keep track of who was saying what, or were you involved from the very beginning on that, or did you come in later?
Well, our involvement was actually to do something for Channel News Asia. Was they were actually looking for, at the stage we came in, was looking for I think, reasons for it happening, and it was a kind of a bit of a strange crisis because of the fact that nobody really knew. So they were looking for terrorists, well, all sorts of different things. It's not that difficult to keep track of what people are saying. You can monitor individuals. You can monitor your top-level guys. You can track their handles, and that part's quite simple. I think in that particular situation it's a little bit difficult though, because it's almost like the most inconceivable, unthinkable crisis that can happen, where you've lost an aeroplane, right? So it's no wonder that there's complete panic in that situation, and they've got no idea how to handle that because, I mean, that is like crisis number one. I think for most brands, what you would usually do, or certainly what we do with clients, is set up different tiers of crisis. So you've got that level one, that's the worst thing that can happen to the organization. And then you've got like level two, these are things that we should maybe be responding to or looking that are trending, for example. So I guess coming back to whether it's really an issue or a crisis, if you start to see issues that are trending and starting to impact the brand, then maybe you start to respond and engage with people. But when you start getting tier one crises, it's very difficult in that situation, I think, to keep control and to keep a clear head because it affects everybody.
But you said, it's a difficult crisis, but that's the number one crisis as an airline you have to prepare for. I remember when I was in DHL, we had 800 intra-Asian flights per day. So we had prepared casualties, non-casualties. So it's all prepared. It's just your basic thing.
But you're talking about an airplane disappearing.
At least you have to have a standard answer first. We are on it. That nobody expects you to solve it in the first day, right?
Yeah, maybe not. But I mean, you wouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It shows the mess of the system. I get that, but. I remember Qantas was in the year of celebrating, I think, 100 years Qantas, and they were one of the safest airlines, never a real incident that year. It was, I think, 2-3 years ago. And they had a new Airbus A380, had an incident with one of its engines, and part of that engine cover fell down on one of the Indonesian islands after they took off from Singapore. So what happened was there was somebody snapping a picture on the mobile phone of that big piece of metal with the Qantas logo on it, and the CEO was alerted by its CFO because suddenly the stock market just crashed the price. And then they were actually very fast in making a statement out, we checked with operations, all planes are there. Something simple as that, but you have to be really fast, react to say, we checked, all are there was an incident, we let you in, right? Of course, if a plane, I think that's a new crisis scenario that every airline now has, what if we don't have an answer? Sad as it is, but, key learning. Another question, yes?
Hi, thank you. Akshay from LinkedIn. This is 2 questions, and again, thank you for everyone's input so far. It was just alluded to about the mess of the system or the challenge of the system. My question is, especially with these brands like United and Pepsi, more often than not, it's not obviously just the CEO or the senior leadership board that has this influence in times of crisis. It is the PR agency. It is third-party partners. So my question is, what is generally speaking the power, if not the accountability, of the agency in such situations to influence the senior leadership or the CEO in such crisis that maybe, for example, in the United Airlines CEO case, how much did their PR agency step up or should have stepped up in that case? And that's a general question, and it's just for the floor. My second question is just around the age of democratization of content, which we're all in at the moment. So with the United Airlines case, we saw, even post the disaster, a lot of memes, a lot of parody videos posted up on YouTube. There was a United Airlines training video, for example, that really prolonged the life cycle of the disaster. How does an agency or the brand or the client really address that?
Any particular person you want to address it, or otherwise I pick?
Just open the floor and let you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Claire, you want to start on what's the role of an agency and how do we manage, especially in a crisis, that relationship with the senior management?
Yeah, so the way we deal with crisis is always 3 parts, right? It's readiness, response, and then recovery. So ideally, before they call us when the crisis hits, we've already worked with them in the past. And I would say that readiness is about 60% of the whole crisis process. Response would be about 10% because that's when it hits and it's quick, it's 2 weeks. The readiness and the recovery, on the other hand, will take months. So the readiness preparation, we as an agency, we already have the key messages and it's a fill-in-the-blanks kind of thing. Fill-in-the-blanks, mainly who fills in these blanks. And we will arrow that during training. It'll be research and development. It'll be HR. In the case of, for example, Uber, it would be compliance and legal. Sometimes they're actually in the training so that they can map out their own scenarios. So it will be 50% the agency legwork for the templatization and the scenario planning and the tangents, the choose your own adventure map. But then it'll be up to the teams and within the companies to actually give us the substance that we need to solve the crisis.
Lena, from your experience, how open or reluctant are a senior leadership to take actually advice and the cue from a consultant?
I think the important issue here is trust. Do the senior leaders have exposure to the agency, and do they trust the agency to give them the best advice? And this, like Claire mentioned earlier, it's very important to build those relationships and have visibility amongst the C-suite so that when a crisis hits, usually it goes either way. Usually, on the agency side, we're already in tune with social listening, and we can see issues bubbling, and we can see some comments coming up that could potentially bubble up into a huge crisis and really be amplified. And that's when we step in and we flag it to our clients on the corp comms and communications team side. But at the same time, when we have that open relationship and direct link to the CEO, to the C-suite, we also float it up to them, and we try as best as possible, of course, to provide them with the best advice. Usually, I would say, as an agency, it is our job to act as consultants, and sometimes the clients don't like to hear what we say, but we're simply presenting the truth, right? And we always have our clients' best interests at heart. And so far, in my experience, luckily, like most of my clients, they have 100% stuck to the strategy that we recommended, and we managed to pull through. And that, completely just solidifies that trust in case anything ever happens again.
I know there are also enough examples out there when a crisis hits, everybody non-core, including agencies, has to leave the building. Langham Hotels in Hong Kong had that issue. They did a campaign for non-Hong Kong citizens or residents to attract people around the quirkiness of some of the Hong Kong ideas to come and see and experience Hong Kong from a different perspective. It backfired in Hong Kong. They pulled the ad and shut out the social media agency who was the only one controlling the social media channels. So they actually lost control on social media in that point of crisis. Most likely not the best idea at that moment, right? But yeah, it comes back to trust. Are you already in early before they put something out that leads to a crisis, or are you just coming in as a fixer, right? And there are all kinds of scenarios. Second question was, does the reality of people playing on crisis with memes, with making fun of it, prolong a crisis, and what can we do about it? Any thoughts on that?
I think it goes back to the vacuum that you spoke of. Because United didn't take responsibility properly, they didn't own the story, they didn't take control, they then lost control to social media, right? As you said, nature abhors a vacuum. So if you don't go out there and tell your story the way it should be told, somebody else is going to tell it for you.
And I remember for the United Airlines example, Southwest put an ad out. We beat the competition, not our customers. Right? Good. Do we have, I think we have time for one last question here at the front table. Oh, sorry. Okay, ladies first, is that okay? Good, thank you.
I like that rule, thank you. I'm Kiri Sinclair in Hong Kong. Okay, so the world is changing. We're looking at a social and PR dimension here. From a consumer brand perspective, where should the first point of response come from the brand? Should it be to the media, on social media, on own channels? Where do you feel the most appropriate place to go when there is a crisis, or does it depend on the crisis?
Open question, open panel. Anybody want to jump in?
I would say the first email. So whenever we do crisis and training scenarios and simulation training, the first email always has to be with internal comms. So usually with social, PR, and media, social will spot the crisis, PR will work on the crisis because they're the messaging experts, but then you need to have the internal comms to actually mitigate it. And then media will start calling much later, actually, because you know how crisis breaks. The first 3 hours of a crisis, it's with messenger apps. So it's even with this room's behavior, it's, hey, I heard about this thing, and I'm not sure, you submit this to your friends, right? 6 hours later, it's in social media networks. So that's when you become an expert. So it's from, this is what I heard, to this is how I feel about this, and I'm a news expert, and this is what happened in United. And then it's the last 12 hours or 10 hours when media comes in. So actually, they're the latest part. So initially, you fix your internal comms so that rumors don't spread, and then you fix your social platforms, because that's where crisis breaks anyway. And then that's when you address media. That's our 3-step approach to it.
Aaron, you want to add something to
Yeah,
that?
I totally agree with Claire. Mainly because the commitment to change or to deal with the issue has to be a collective one, and you need the entire organization behind it before you go out and make a public statement of it.
And so my question is, where is that public statement? Where do you make that public statement? On what channel?
Where should the public statement go to? Which channel?
I guess it depends where the crisis is happening. Is it, I mean, if it's completely, should we say, global or right across the net, then maybe you make it as a proper press release statement. But I mean, if it's something that's happening on Facebook, it would make sense to talk directly to that audience. So.
And that comes back a little bit to preparedness. It should be where your audience is. If it's on Facebook, make sure you can put something up within an hour on Facebook on Sunday morning at 5 a.m. But too many clients, you know, they still think in 9 to 5 patterns. If it's happening on YouTube, you should be ready to put something on YouTube. If it happens on Twitter, reply on Twitter. Something very simple has been around for ages, but still a lot of companies are not prepared. It's kind of a dark page of your website. If a massive crisis happens, switch your start page, your landing page, to a very simple, we're in crisis mode, that happens. Bad example of that was when the Costa Concordia cruise ship capsized in front of Italy because the captain wanted to go too close to the coastline. A couple of people died tragically. They were caught in, drowned. And even days after the crisis, you went to the website of Costa Cruises, and they were advertising spring tours, spring cruises with the Costa Concordia. Obviously, something really, really bad backfires, and that's where communications comes together 360. When a crisis hits, please make sure you have the right button to push to pull all advertising. If it's a massive crisis, you don't want to advertise because you can't advertise your way out of a crisis. You can buy your share of attention, but you can't advertise yourself out of a crisis, right? So it's a lot of actually checkpoints. At the end of the day, is your website ready? Who can post on Facebook? Can your CEO go on YouTube? And do you only have the corporate 5-page legally approved statement? Because for the longest time, corporates always told you, we don't apologize because that admits guilt. Right? So apparently a way around this is not saying sorry, but we are sorry how you feel. I'm not sure if that works anymore, right? But I think the BP example, the Gulf of Mexico example, Deepwater Horizon, where that oil platform blew up, and they didn't have a backup plan, and oil kept pouring in, they couldn't stop the story, right? Originally, it was the blame game. BP said it's not us because somebody else operates the platform. The platform operator said it's not us, it's the holding in Switzerland who commissioned us. So it took actually about nearly 5 days to take ownership of the crisis. What was the idea? At that point in the US, the maximum liability for crisis like that, environment and people losing their lives, was I think 6 or 7 billion US dollars. Did BP wants to pay 6 to 7 billion US dollars? No. Do you know what they, at the end of the day, they paid for the cleaning up efforts, CSR efforts? Somewhere around 30 to 40 billion dollars. And that's an interesting, I think, change on crisis over the past decade, that it's not so much the legal permission to operate that we're talking about, it's the moral permission to operate. That's where you build your kind of social karma, and it's, I think, the role of PR is actually, and communications is increasing because you need the buy-in from the audience, not just your legal permits, right? Okay, I think we have to wrap up, so I want to ask the panelists one last question each, or your take on that. Do social media crises exist, or is it actually just an amplification of real-world issues? You want to start?
I think unless it's completely fake news, a social media crisis probably has its roots in some real-world problems. But I think all of us, we have experienced the amplification of social media all too well in any given situation.
I agree as well. I think social media as a tool is used to really amplify and change perceptions as well of what people see, and people misconstrue certain campaigns, certain messages, certain issues. So it really is an amplification tool.
Yeah, and if you look at campaigns that have been called a crisis recently, I'm not sure that they're real crisis. Do they really impact the brand in terms of turnover and stock value and everything else? So I would say, yeah, it's more for amplification.
I think social media is increasingly becoming a social leveler. Everyone has access to it, whether you're rich or poor, you hate something or you don't. To be frank, all brands can't please everybody, so just be strategic with your key target audience and just go for it. Yeah.
I would say there's no such thing as a social media crisis unless Facebook shut down, because social media is a platform for crisis. Simply because, like I work with KFC, and usually what we saw is that, for example, if you see a glove inside your chicken, the first thing you'll do is to take a photo of it before you even go to the counter. And it's because people use it as a weapon. In case they don't help me, then I have something to do. So the crisis is rooted in customer service or compliance or the product itself. Social media will turn it into a crisis if your brand doesn't handle it properly.
So let's hope that our lunch doesn't have any gloves in there or anything else. Let's be gentle, and I think also the interesting thing, all of us are on the brand side, but also on the consumer side, and I see myself sometimes in that kind of schizophrenic situation. How can consumers do that? And the next morning I'll take a picture of my burger of McDonald's or something like that. Right? So let's be fair to everybody. Thank you very much to the great panelists here, Claire, Tucci, Stephen, Lina,